Let's see. Okay. Hello, welcome people. I'm going to wait for some more people to show up before I begin talking. So please be patient. Okay, hey everybody. Can you guys hear me? Well, I'll get started. Hi, my name is Michetti. I'm a local artist on the Central Coast, and I'm also a structural engineer and a software developer, so I try to juggle all three at the same time. But today I'm going to do a demo for you about oil painting. And oil painting is a very complex and vast subject matter to talk about, so I'm going to try to make it concise since we're going to try to do the demo within about a half an hour. And I wanted to focus on a few things and not get too broad on the subject of oil painting because there's just too much to cover. And I want to provide you guys with information that anybody can use, whether they're new to oil painting or maybe they've been doing it a while. And I thought, what better type of painting to discuss, and it's a type of painting that I really enjoy, and it is called plein air painting. And plein air painting, it's a French term that was coined from the French Impressionistic period, and it was very popular then. And basically, it's painting outdoors. And there's so many great benefits to painting something in real life. And there's something very enjoyable and therapeutic to being out in nature and just focusing on nature and just, being out there. And there's a lot of things to it that are complicated because so many things are changing while you're painting outdoors, and you got to have the right materials. And there's a big difference between painting outdoors and painting in a studio. And there's so many things that are different. One thing is you got to paint faster. So you paint faster because the light changes, the weather changes, cloud patterns can change, you can get a marine layer that blows in. And I've had so many of those things happen. Or you want to paint faster simply because you're being attacked by bugs, or maybe there's a lot of tourists around you. I don't know. There's so many reasons. The wind picking up, that can become very problematic because everything can just blow over. And so there were so many times where the wind will pick up and I'll have to hold on to my gear while I'm painting. And so, also just the big difference with studio painting is you get a chance to explore. You get to go to different locations and you get to create art while exploring those locations. There's times where I go hiking for miles before I even find a spot, and it's just so enjoyable. And I've also, a nice thing too about plein air painting is it's a great thing to get into, because if you don't have a lot of space, you don't have to have a big setup. In fact, you want a minimalistic setup. And so it's great for anybody just starting out because they don't have to dedicate, a whole room to get into oil painting. And not only that, it's something that you can take with you. I've taken my painting setup on numerous trips, whether it's backpacking or doing overseas trips to Italy or New Zealand. And it's a little cumbersome sometimes to bring that extra gear, but it's so nice to have that because sometimes you see something beautiful and you just want to sit there and paint it. And so I've had a lot of great experiences with it. And so a nice thing too about it is that for demo purposes, it's something where you don't have to get into as many complexities, because for one thing, when you're doing an outdoor painting or plein air painting, you're doing everything in usually one sitting, or you're standing in this case, but you're doing everything in one pass. And so there's another term for that where you're not doing successive layers on top of each other. Instead, you're doing one pass, and it's called alla prima. So when you're outdoor painting, most people are almost always doing an alla prima painting. And there are pros and cons to it. One thing is that it tends to look a little less refined, but that can be desirable because your painting's going to look more lively. You're going to typically see more brush strokes in it. And, if you've ever looked at some studio paintings, sometimes they look overworked. Well, with a plein air painting, you're probably not going to get that because you don't have enough time to have that happen. Really, you need to do things as fast as possible. And so in this case, because it's a demo, I can complete a painting relatively quickly. Now, we're not outdoors, obviously, for various technical reasons, but I'm going to go through with you the process of how I start and hopefully how I generally finish a plein air oil painting. And so I'm going to go through with you guys the different types of materials that I use. And these are materials that you can use for in the studio or outdoors as well. So I'm going to try to kind of cover everything in general. from the types of paints I use, the mediums I use, the solvents, all the different brushes you have available to use, and also the painting surfaces, and also some of the equipment that you'll need in order to basically keep your painting in place and to have your palette where you can mix your paints, and just all the various things that come along with trying to get everything set up. So basically, at the end of the day, you know, it took me a while to get to this point, but everything I need to go painting, I can take with me in a backpack as small as this. So in here is essentially everything I need to go painting. And you know, the same setup can be used also in a studio setting. You can do this indoors. I mean, you can paint anywhere if you have the setup. You can go to workshops if you have this. I've brought setups like this to workshops, to other artists' studios to do, you know, practice painting, portraiture, figurative. I have different easel and painting box setups, and so I have a little bit of a variety because I've been doing this for a while. But you really only need maybe like one slightly larger than average painting box, and I'll go over, you know, my setup, and I'll show you, you know, like another setup I have that is bulkier. And basically, you know, you have a lot of options with this versus having kind of a stationary painting setup that's stuck in your home. While it's nice and you can do larger paintings, if you're just getting into it, or if you're interested in doing plein air painting, I suggest having a setup like this in a backpack that you can just easily take with you, because you want as few excuses to go out and do painting as you can, because, you know, it's always something for a lot of people that comes secondary. And, you know, sometimes I even have to fight with it, even though, you know, me as trying to be a professional painter, I also have other obligations. So, you know, I'm also a structural engineer and a software developer. So I always have plenty of excuses to not paint. So having everything ready to go where it needs, I can almost just grab it and go, is just awesome for me. You know, if I have a friend call me up and say, hey, you want to go painting? I'm like, oh yeah, let's go. So if I'm available. But anyways, so next I'm going to go and show you, I'm going to change the view, and I'm going to show you the paints I use. I've taken the paints out of my backpack. I'm going to go over just the setup I use for painting, and it's considered I guess a full palette. So there's typically two terms for the amount of paint you have based on your color palette. And so there's a full palette and there's a limited palette. I'm going to show you my minimalistic full palette. So a lot of like big artists, they have, if you look at their websites or if you've gone to their web workshops, they'll have a long list of paints. And I've found over the years that fumbling through all the paints, it can be a little bit tedious, and I've gotten to the point where I'm like, okay, I don't need all these extra cheater tubes of paints all the time. Sometimes I like them, sometimes I don't. Oh, and by the way, if anybody has any questions, of course, feel free to message me. I have a monitor next to me so I can see if anyone has some questions. I'm pretty vague with everything so far, but if any questions come up, please feel free to ask. And anyways, so on the topic of a full palette, I'm going to show you my palette that I bring with me when I go outdoor painting, and you can use it for really anything because it has all the basics you need to really paint any subject. I mean, it could be a still life, it could be, you know, portrait, figurative, or outdoors. So I'm going to go over that with you, and I'm going to show you the typical mediums I use. Some of them I don't use as much, but I'll show them to you anyways. And then the solvents I use and the brushes. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with that. All right, so I have here just sort of my painting setup, and I've kind of laid out for you the oil paints that I typically use. So I start out usually what you want to do is arrange your palette where you lay your paints out in a fashion that you always remember. So that way, after doing it enough times, it becomes like second nature to you and you don't have to think about it. You pull out the color, you know where to put it on your palette. And so this is an example of a palette. This is just sort of a mobile one that you can put in your hand. I think this was from a French easel, but I thought for the purposes of this demo, I would just use this. And so starting from left to right, I kind of go from like high key, warm colors over to the more darker and cooler colors. And so I have a lot of different brands. Probably my favorites would be Gamblin. And by the way, I was told that there's a discount code where you can get 30% off of Gamblin paints at Art Central if you use the code, I think it's code Lee, and then so it's CODELEE, and the L is capitalized, I believe. So try that out. I think that'll probably be posted somewhere on Instagram as well. But yeah, you'll get 30% off, and that's a great deal. So here we have titanium white is the first one, and this is just a really good all-around white that, I pretty much have never had to use any other type of white. Some people use different types, but titanium white is great. And you'll need a yellow, definitely. I typically use cadmium yellow. I like the brighter color of the lemon yellow. And so I tend to go with this because I find it a little bit more versatile. Maybe outdoors too. There's a lot of kind of lighter, maybe because the grasses and say the summertime, they're kind of a very light to dull yellow color in the hills. Next is cadmium orange, and then we have here cadmium red. We have burnt umber, which I use a lot actually. At first I didn't. I tended to use more of. This is a great color too. I tend to use this more in portraiture perhaps, but this is transparent oxide red. But I found that I can get a lot of nice dark colors by mixing burnt umber with other colors on my palette. And so I've been using that as kind of my go-to earthy dark brown color, and I really like it. Next up is ultramarine blue. I know it's hard to see because I've crimped it to get all the paint out as much as I can. But ultramarine blue is a nice color, not only for skies and water, but it's also nice because it's cheaper. When I first started getting into painting, all the big artists were like always had cobalt blue on their palettes, and I was like, oh, I have to get cobalt blue, and I used it for a long time. But a bottle of it or a tube of it is relatively expensive. So I've eventually kind of converted over to ultramarine, which is kind of more of a reddish blue, but you can, in real life, blues aren't so super saturated. So even though it's starting out as a little more reddish in color, I can still shift it to how I need, because in real life, you're not going to be using cobalt blue straight out of the tube. You're not going to be using ultramarine straight out of the tube. So it's a compromise, and I've really gotten used to using ultramarine. And by the way, this is, let's see, so another manufacturer. Now this is a bit of a higher end brand. This is M. Graham. And I think most professional artists have kind of switched over to this. It's a lot more expensive. But I would say mid-range, my favorite is still Gamblin. And honestly, I think both of them are great because you can paint straight out of the tube. Some of them you definitely need to supplement with a little extra medium or to kind of thin it down with some solvent. Especially some of the Winsor Newtons I found can be a little thicker. And, for some that might be good if you're painting really thick. But if you're doing an initial layer, typically you want to start it a little thinner because you're going to be painting over that. And if you add too much paint, from the get-go, it's going to be really hard to mix and make changes later on. And so this stuff can be a little problematic, but it's still not bad. I'm just kind of nitpicking there. Winsor Newton is still really good as well. Obviously, I'm using it, so it's not that bad. And then lastly, on my typical palette, I use Viridian. And so this is another expensive paint, but I feel like there's really no good alternatives to Viridian. Viridian is just, I mean, you can use it in any situation. I have other greens that are kind of my cheat colors, but I can almost always get the color I need by mixing other colors with Viridian. So if you want a brighter, fresher green, you introduce, cadmium lemon to it, and you get that kind of green, fresh, kind of springtime green. If I want a cheap green, I have two of them actually. I have Bright Green Lake, and I'm sure other manufacturers have similar paints. M. Graham probably has something similar that looks like this. This is just the name from this manufacturer. This one's really nice because sometimes it is hard to get to that brighter green before the color starts to get a little muddied. And so if I really want the green to pop and to be bright green, I'll probably bring this with me. And so I'll tend to use this more in the springtime when the greens are just kind of that fresher, brighter note of green. And then I'll also sometimes, another cheat color I have is Golden Green, which is kind of this warmer green. It's a lot warmer than Viridian. And this is nice because it's kind of like pre-muddied down for you a little bit. It's a little browner, oranger, whatever you want to call it. And that's really helpful too. Some other colors that are very typical from that other artists use, and I've used them plenty, but lately I haven't been using them, but a lot of times you'll see people using yellow ochre. Now this is a huge tube, so it looks kind of funny, but this is one I use a lot in the studio, but I've been using it less and less when doing plein air painting because I like to just have just the minimum colors that I need to get the job done. So that's yellow ochre. It's a kind of a nice, kind of a duller in between of yellow and orange. And it's really nice because it's a very kind of natural color. And so you can use it for a lot of things. I mean, you can use it for portraiture, you can use it for landscaping, anything really. It's very versatile. So let's move on next to solvents, because solvents are extremely important, and as I'll show in the demo when I finally get to it. They're extremely important for cleaning your brushes as well as for thinning the paint for your underpainting. So when you're starting an oil painting, you're typically going to use a solvent to kind of get a general wash while you're sketching it out and to kind of get an idea what your composition is going to look like. And so the one I use the most is from Gamblin. Is this? Yeah, so here it is. This is from Gamblin. Pretty sure you can get this from Art Central, and it's really good stuff. It's odorless mineral spirits. I use this, I put it in my little portable paint bucket, whatever you call this, canister. And that's what I use not only to clean the brush, but also to kind of thin down the first layer of painting. Now, you don't want to keep using odorless mineral spirits the whole time because you'll just water down your painting. It'll be runny, and it can also kind of break down the binder and the pigment. So you don't want to use too much of it all the time, but for really thin layers, it's excellent because it dries fast and it thins things down. And it doesn't cause like a buildup. So some of the other painting mediums will give you sort of a buildup or a thicker, what they call fatter paint layer. And so a typical term used for the process of layering your paints is called painting fat over lean. And it's regarded to be the right way to paint because you want to have your oilier paint layers be on top of your thinner paint layers because you need the top layers to be more flexible or else they can crack. You don't want to go the other way around and have a lean, thin layer of paint necessarily on top of something that is kind of more flexible. So that's a term, you can look it up. It's called fat over lean. There's a lot of, I don't know, it's kind of, I guess oil painting is a very chemistry type thing. It's like you're doing a chemistry project, you know. There's so many different factors. And so doing things a way that is recommended is sort of a catch-all safety net to make sure that you don't make a beautiful painting and then years later it cracks or something else goes wrong, you know, or it yellows. Another thing is it can yellow a lot. So, okay, so we've gone over solvents. Those are very important. They go in your little paint can. Secondly, once you kind of get your underpainting done, you can move on to other things called mediums. Now, the mediums are what you mix in with your paint to add flow, to increase, basically, you pick a medium based on what you want it to do because different mediums serve different purposes. And so some of them are just there to kind of add flow. So when you brush, you're able to kind of spread the paint more smoothly and the paint can go a lot further. Others will help increase fluidity, but also increase the drying time or decrease the drying time. So some, like liquid, as you can see, I don't use this much, so it looks kind of funny. This will really speed up drying. Like you can have your painting dried if you use a lot of this in your paints, and it's mixed in and you paint with it, it'll dry extremely fast. Some people like that, some people don't. It's kind of just whatever your needs are. I tend to like my paints to stay wet for as long as possible because I don't want them to get tacky and start drying before I'm done working in it, especially if I'm doing an alla prima painting, which I discussed before is like doing everything in one pass. If you let it dry first, well, it's no longer one pass. You're then having to paint on top of a layer, and you're no longer mixing the paint that you put down before. You're now painting on top of. And this is a very common thing to do when you're doing a studio painting where you have a lot of time. And in fact, sometimes you don't want to wait for the paint to dry because you want to keep working on it the next day. In this case, liquid is great for that because you can paint one day, you mix in some liquid, and the next day it's going to be dry and you can keep going with it. On that note, there are some paint colors that take longer to dry than others. For instance, titanium white can take a long time to dry. And so if you're using a lot of white, it may take a long time before your painting is dry enough, if you're in a studio, to go back and touch it up or do your next layer. Some dry a lot faster. For instance, I found burnt umber can dry really fast. I mean, it dries so fast that sometimes if I'm painting outdoors and the wind picks up, just the wind itself can dry the paint and start making it kind of tacky and dry, and I might have to add some solvent to get the fluidity of it back up. So some more natural, well, actually I'll just go to this one next. So this is the one I typically use for a non-natural one. I like this one a little bit better than the liquid. Neo, I don't even know how to say that, but it's a really great all-purpose medium. I like it because it adds some really nice flow, but it doesn't make the drying time speed up too fast. So to me, this is a little bit better than the original liquid. I think liquid has probably a similar one that takes longer to dry and is similar in some ways, but I prefer this one. You can write that down. I'm not even going to try to say it. Neo McGilt. I don't know. So here's two natural ones. Both of them are great. I think, I'm not sure which one yellows more than the other. I actually forget, but over time, as the oil cures, it can, one of them, all oils tend to kind of naturally yellow over time. And it's just, if you go to an art museum or things, or you look at an old painting, you'll often see that the painting has gotten kind of yellowed. Well, part of that is probably the oil that they used. But linseed oil, I mean, it's used, I think if you look at a lot of different tubes of paint, you'll see some of the active ingredients they're typically linseed or walnut. So some brands use walnut, some brands use linseed. If you want to take a more natural approach, say you're painting in the studio, you can actually use walnut oil to clean your brushes. So as a substitute to having a strong solvent that is toxic in your can that you use for cleaning your brushes, I've tried it and it works pretty well, but you can use walnut oil. And yeah, it smells better. It's not going to fry your brain cells. So I would say look into that. This is a good alternative if you're sensitive to things like turpentine or odorless mineral spirits, because it's less harmful in general, but it's oil, so there are some downsides to it as well. The linseed oil is a really good one too. I like this brand a lot. It's a Classical Studio Chelsea. Oh, I guess it's Chelsea Classical Studio. And on the note of solvents, so there's odorless mineral spirits. There is turpentine, which to me, I just do not like. This is probably really old. I used this when I was first starting out because maybe I was looking at some old art books and this is what they recommended. I don't like the smell of it. I don't like it. I mean, the benefit of having a smellier solvent over an odorless is there is a safety benefit in that you will know when the room is gotten too saturated with the solvent fumes, and that's important. So on that note, this is not a safe solvent to use in an enclosed room with no ventilation. You should not use it because you cannot tell what the fume content is in the air. You can't smell it, so that's bad. On the plus side, it doesn't smell bad, but then you don't have that safety buffer. So I've looked around for a while and I looked for alternatives, and one that I started using that is kind of my go-to for working in the studio, it's called lavender spike oil. Now, I don't recommend this unless you're more invested into oil painting and you're going to be spending more time doing it, because this stuff is not cheap. I mean, lavender stuff in general isn't cheap, so imagine a big bottle of oil, spike oil, and it's not really like an oil, it's more of a solvent. So the name is a little misleading, but it's a solvent that you can clean your brushes with, you can use in your underpainting, and it smells great. It smells like lavender. And so it's almost therapeutic smelling, even though I'm sure it's not as good for you to inhale. I think this is a little less toxic than some of these other ones like turpentine and odorless mineral spirits. So I do recommend this. This is nice too, because if you're in a space and it starts to smell strong, you'll know that you need to ventilate more, or you need to leave the room and kind of let the fumes dissipate. So I do use this a lot. And so let's see, next up, let's get into brushes. I think brushes would be a good thing to get into next. So I have a variety of brushes here, and they all have their different purposes, but I'm just going to kind of go over the standard shapes and types. So most of the ones I have are long-handled brushes. So they're longer, and the benefit to that is that you can kind of hold your hand further away from the painting that you're working on. So if I have a painting, I can do things a little more broad and kind of loose, and you can have a more painterly effect, and it keeps you far enough away from the painting that you're less likely to not see proportion mistakes, and you'll get a better view. It's always a good idea to look back from your painting and be able to see it further back, because at close up you're going to miss a lot of things, and because in real life, when a painting's finished, you're looking at a painting further back. You're not necessarily have your face smack up against your painting, which I know I have the tendency to, because sometimes I'll get into high detail mode, but then I'll look back and what looked good close up doesn't look good far back, which is the most important view. So having the long brush is a huge advantage for a lot of reasons. So long brush handles, very common. So I'll get into the different types. So there's typically two types of materials. There's the natural bristle type brushes, and they're basically the hairs are thicker. And so this will typically lead to a stiffer brush, which means that you can really shovel the paint around more, and also the texture will show more of these thick brush strokes. So you'll see in a painting that uses a lot of the bristle brush, you can really see the wiriness it kind of imprinted in the paint strokes. So the other common type is synthetic. Now synthetic tends to be very kind of smooth and shiny and soft. And this is great for, just a lot of things. If you want a cleaner, smoother looking brush stroke, this is definitely the way to go. And then there's also some that are just from animals. So there's a lot of different types. I think this is from a mongoose. Now this isn't maybe this isn't the most animal friendly, but if you're very serious about paint, and I was at a time, this is from a company a lot of artists use, named Rosemary & Co. A lot of the kind of big artists use this. So it's advertised from like very popular artists like Jeremy Lipking often, and so I use them a lot, and I do recommend them if you're more serious about art. But honestly, you don't need to buy expensive brushes to make a good painting. My recommendation is to start developing a variety of brushes, collecting a variety of brushes, not developing. So collect a variety of brushes and use them, and find out which types you like the most, and find out in what cases, when do you use this brush, when do you use that brush. I have a lot of different types, but the standard ones are, you have filberts. So filberts are rounded on the tip. You have flats. So this is a flat. So as you can see, it's flat, and this will create more of a straight edge and tile type brush stroke, versus this one will give you kind of obviously more curved, and you can both of them have their purposes. The best thing to do is just try them out. There's also shorter haired ones, like this is I think this would be called a flat bright. So brights are typically short, kind of squatty brushes. And then another popular one that, especially for detailing, is a round. So this is a pointed round, and the rounds are great, obviously, for doing very fine detail work. But you can also get kind of thicker rounds too. With every type of brush shape, you can get a variety of sizes. You can go from very small, which they typically will call like size 0, up to, super large. I mean, I have some big brushes here. What number is this? They all have a scale. So this would be a number 16 flat long handle brush. So there's also kind of more strange ones. There's fan brushes. This can be good if you're kind of blending things, like skin tone. If you want to blend skin tone, that's really nice. So beyond that, I think we've covered most of brushes. Let's move on to painting surfaces. So I think most people have seen canvas paintings on stretcher bars, so I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to discuss instead what I like to use, not only in the studio, but also for plein air painting, and that is aluminum composite panels. So you can get these from perhaps even at Art Central. I haven't checked, but there's these panels that you can buy bare, or they can be pre-primed. This one I've primed myself. I typically will buy unprimed or ungessoed aluminum panels, and then I'll gesso them myself, so that way I can control, the texture on it. Now this has more of a smooth finish, but sometimes you might want to leave the brush strokes in your gesso, so you get sort of like a faux canvas weave to it. Another thing you can do with these aluminum panels is you can actually glue on canvas. So it's kind of an alternative to using canvas on stretcher bars. The problem with stretcher bars, while a lot of people like sort of the springiness to having a canvas stretched on a frame, there's downsides to it. Over time, the canvas can become loose. It's really easy for a painting to become damaged. So if you're transporting a canvas and it's on stretcher bars, the frame that it's stapled to, like, it's easy to puncture, warp. Any weight is on it. So if you're moving or traveling with it, it can get injured. With something mounted to a aluminum panel board, it's a composite, so it's like 2 layers of aluminum and with a foam core. And this is the same type of material that is used outdoors for like stop signs or commercial signs. And I've actually bought 4-foot by 8-foot panels of this stuff from local sign shops. I don't know that they necessarily like it, but to sell it like that, but I've done it before to save some money. And so these are gessoed, and the gessos I typically use, or at least the ones that I'm familiar with, are golden gesso. This one's really good. And then the other one is Jerry's World's Greatest Gesso, self-proclaimed. And I like both of them. I would say this one's a little chalkier feeling, which can be nice because it feels a little kind of grippier on the paint. And I found it's a little easier to sand. This one's nice too. It's more acrylic. It's kind of has more of a shinier, less chalky type of material. And so they both have their pros and cons. And so basically what you do is you prep these panels by lightly sanding them with a very fine grit. And then you paint it with a brush several times over, and then when you have enough coverage, you lightly sand it down so that way you can get the smoothness you want, and then you can kind of just paint directly on it from there. Another thing that I will typically use is it's basically a canvas paper. So let's see, do I have any? Well, there's also papers that you can use to paint on, and I'll use that. Here's one from Arches. This is called, I guess, oil paper, and it is able to take oil paint without warping a lot. And so it's pretty useful if you just want kind of more of like a sketchier kind of painting, or if you're just practicing and you don't want to have a bunch of thick paintings just lying around that you don't necessarily want to keep. I mean, this is a little more expensive stuff. There's also stuff from Canson called Canva paper, and I use that a lot for plein air painting. I don't think I have a pad of it to show you, but it's called Canva paper, and it's by the brand Canson, and that's pretty good too. They both have their pros and cons. Like, a lot of issues with the paper type of oil paper is that you end up having your oil in your paints get soaked in, and so you'll find that your painting gets kind of dry really fast, and that can be kind of hard to paint if you're used to doing things more flowy and to kind of, you know, spread your paint out more. You have to basically be okay with that not happening as much. But besides that, it's a great surface to work on. I've seen some really beautiful paintings done on oil paper from great artists. And so it's fun to try both things. It's, you know, really trying everything and getting familiar with it will expand your knowledge and just make you a better artist in general, I feel. So next I'm going to set up, I think at this point it would be great to show you my painting setup I'm going to use today, and it's the painting setup that I use when I go oil painting outdoors, so when I'm plein air painting. Now, everything can go into a backpack that I use, and so things I take with me when I go painting outdoors, number one would probably be sunscreen, because you are going to get sunburned while you're out in nature for hours, especially if you're by the ocean. The reflection off the ocean water will really burn you, especially if you're as pale as I am. So another thing you want to make sure to bring is plenty of gloves, because oil painting is toxic, and in fact you should be using gloves anytime you're painting. There's a lot of harmful chemicals in paints that can basically get absorbed into your skin. You want to stay away a lot from the cadmiums. They're very harmful. I think they're like carcinogens basically. So, and for some reason, I swear the cadmium colors, the most toxic ones are the ones that tend to get on my glove the most. I don't know what it is, but if I didn't wear gloves, I would probably be covered in really toxic chemicals all the time. So wear gloves. Now I'm going to show you what I tend to store my my painting surfaces in. So this is one that I actually bought from Art Central. This is a brand called Raymar, and it's really great because it's almost like a corrugated cardboard material, but it's made out of plastic, but it's really lightweight, and so you can get different sizes of it. I think I have 8x10 box, but this is a 6x8. So you buy the size you're planning to use the most when you go out painting. So this is a 6x8, and so I have stored in here 6x8 panels that I can just take with me when I go, and I have them ready to go, and I can do, you know, several paintings in one day if I want to. I don't have to go back and retrieve anymore. I just have them in this container. So I'm going to pull that out because that's what I'm going to be painting on today. And so next up, let me show you my painting box. So this is what's referred to as a pochade box. Now, that's another French term, I believe. Probably started also at the same time as the French Impressionism period of time. And so it's basically a way to easily take with you a palette that you can store paints in, and you can also mount your panel to and paint from. So this is one I made myself. I keep making smaller more minimalistic ones as I have been painting throughout the years, and I enjoy making my own. But most people aren't going to be making their own. You can also buy them, obviously. And so my first one I bought was from a company called Open Box M. And this is a large one, and I've used it. It's great, when you're starting out, because you might want a lot more area to paint and mix paints. And it's definitely got its usage. It has its own kind of proprietary way of holding on to your canvas or your panel. And it's a lot bulkier and heavier, so I don't use it as much because I like to do a lot of backpacking around before I find a spot where I want to paint. And I got kind of tired of having something so heavy on my back. But this is perfect if you're just planning on painting, near a roadside, or if you want to paint something larger, because this will accommodate a larger panel or canvas. And it gives you a lot more surface to paint from. Now, this originally didn't have the glass, but I added the glass because it's easy to clean and scrape off excess paint. And so, at the end of the day, with the paint that you don't use, if you're done painting, you can just easily clean it off. And you can get it really clean. It's not that clean right now, but you could always take some acetone in a well-ventilated area, and you can completely clean off the glass, and it'll look like new. So going back to this setup, this one's much smaller, but it's all I really need because I typically just use these 6" by 8" panels to paint from. So beyond that, I'll typically, because I don't have a good way to clip it, I just take like a big clip and I'll just manually clip to the lid of this. And so the next thing that's important, of course, is having a tripod. So I have a few tripods, and I've just tried them throughout the years and tried to find ones that I like. Here's the one I'm currently using. I like this because it's short, so it fits into a smaller backpack, which is really handy because, being in a smaller backpack, it's easier to take this for like camping trips or longer travels. And it's relatively lightweight, but still kind of sturdy. So there's different options. I have bulkier ones, I have lighter ones, but the light ones start to feel really flimsy, especially if it's windy. And the bulky ones, of course, are just really heavy and not that enjoyable to carry around. So this is the one I typically use with this pochade box. And yeah, it works pretty well. Most tripods that you buy come with like a quick mount release kind of a mechanism, so you can pretty quickly just attach your pochade box to the tripod just by kind of tightening and clamping it on. And then a nice thing about a pochade box too is that you can actually, if you want, you can paint from a desk or a bench. So you're not limited to just being stuck on a tripod. So, pochade boxes are great if you're just starting out painting. And I've seen like a typical way to make these is by taking like an old wooden cigar box. And I'm pretty sure that I've seen them sold at Art Central. I don't know if they still sell them, but I have seen them there, and they're pretty cute. They're small. They're you don't have a lot of space to paint, but you have enough, and you can do like small paintings on the go. You can make your own, or there's so many brands available, and there's so many different price ranges that the best thing to do if you're interested is just to look online and just look at forums and kind of decide what's going to work best for you. For me, I didn't really care about having something so big where I can store all my paints and mediums and brushes in it. I just wanted something lightweight that I could paint on and attach a painting to. And so this is as basic and functional as I need it. And it took me years to get to this point. So I wouldn't expect anybody to start out with something like this. It might be better, in fact, to do something bulkier and larger because it gives them more options. But for me, this is perfect for the setup I know that I'll end up using. And so I think next I'm just going to go ahead and get set up, I'm going to take a moment, put my phone on the phone clip so that way I'm not shaking the camera around, and if you guys give me a minute, I'll set up my push-out box on the tripod, and I can lay out the paints, and then I can show you the painting I plan on to I guess demonstrate for you guys. So as you can see, this is pretty fast to set up, if you can see it all right. Now this tripod you basically clamp down, and you want to make sure they're tightened down all the way, because there's been several times when I've been out in the field painting and I didn't have one tightened down all the way. I started painting and then my tripod tips over, which, you know, sucks. So make sure you have this tightened down all the way. All right, so let's tighten down. You can always give it kind of the wiggle test and make sure that, you know, if you put a little pressure on the legs that they don't move. And you know, a lightweight tripod isn't the most stable to begin with, so you always got to be attentive to it. You might have your tripod on rocks or sand, you just don't know, so it's not always going to be stable. And this simply attaches to this ball head mount, which then enables me to easily kind of move it into a position that works well. A lot of times when you're outdoors, you have to think about how to position it, because as the light changes, you don't want to go from shaded to the sunlight basically beaming down on your painting, because you're changing how you perceive it. You want to be consistent, at least with the lighting that is cast onto your panel. Now sometimes it's nice to just have it in ambient light, so the light from the sky. Sometimes you don't have the choice. Maybe you're going to be painting in direct light where the light is shining directly on it. I think the important thing is to be consistent throughout, because the painting is going to look different in different lights. That's just the truth about it. And so shake the camera harder. I just saw that. Well, I can't do that anymore. It's mounted. So basically, yeah, my suggestion is to try it out where you have maybe one time where your painting is in direct light. Try it when it's in shadow. You have to adjust how you paint for each of those situations. If you have it in shadow, you're going to tend to paint things brighter. So you're going to use more white typically, or lighter colors. And when you're in the light, you're going to tend to make your painting darker. So one thing that I struggle with is if I'm painting and the light is directly cast onto my paints and also my my painting, I'll end up painting it in a way that to me looks good when I'm there in that bright light, and then I come home and I put it in a darker room like this room, and the painting will just look super dark. And I think that's kind of the worst case scenario, is where you're painting in full sunlight and you come in and you end up with a very dark painting in a room. So I would suggest that maybe paint more in ambient light, but I've done both, and you just have to be attentive to the idea that what you see in bright full sunlight is going to be different. So I'm going to go ahead and apply my paints. So you can probably already see that I have kind of remaining paint And so you can see just where I typically place my paints. So I'm going to go with titanium white. And actually at this point I'm going to put my gloves on, because at this point I could definitely end up getting paint on my hands. Does anybody have any questions so far? There's just a lot to cover, and so I know it's really hard to cover everything in a short period of time. And so it's already been a long period of time, hasn't it? I guess there's just so much information here. It's going to take longer. So here's cadmium yellow. Cadmium orange. Cadmium red. Burnt umber. And again, if you want 30% off, Art Central has a code. The code is code Lee, so CODELEE. My name is Lee Michetti, so you can use that code and you can get 30% off at Art Central on your Gamblin oil paints. That's what I've been told. It's a pretty good deal. So that was ultramarine, and then finally gonna add Viridian. So another thing that I have in my setup is a holder for my brushes. It's pretty dirty, you know, it lays on the ground a lot, so it doesn't look great, but it has a variety of brushes. Now, because I'm doing typically smaller 6x8 paintings, I don't typically need as large of brushes. So for these, for what I'm usually doing, I usually have smaller brushes with me. And one thing I didn't mention, which is extremely important, is always have a palette knife with you. Now, palette knives are multi-use. You can use it to draw with. You can use it for making straight lines, so you can do things like grasses, brushes. If you're doing architectural stuff, or you're painting something like a boat or a car, anything man-made, if you want a straight edge, it can be really hard to do with a brush, and it's very easy to do with a palette knife. So, and some people, they can do a whole painting with a palette knife. That's not what I like to do. I like to use a variety. So my goal is I like to make paintings look more interesting by having different types of brushes that I use during the whole process. So sometimes I will use the palette knife, and it's just one more way to make the painting look more alive and kind of exciting, because if you use the same brush, same exact brush, the whole painting, it'll look good, but without that variety, it does feel a little more stagnant. So anyways, I'm just going to use the same brushes that I typically use when I go out plein air painting. And then I will have a paint can with me of odorless mineral spirits. Now, the seals on these tend to go bad over time, and this one has, so I'm using one of the gloves as a sort of a makeshift seal, and then I put everything in a Ziploc bag because, I mean, these will leak, especially if you lay them, you know, on their side like this. Eventually you will get some seepage, and so this is just a way to make sure that my backpack doesn't get gross from dirty, odorless mineral spirits. But today I'm going to be using my solvent that I use in studio because it's a little less toxic. And then you always want to have with you garbage bags as well as paper towels, because you're going to need to clean your brushes and you're going to need to clean off your palette once you're done. But all of this stuff can definitely fit into a smaller bag. So I'm going to I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on the painting. And then also I am going to bring up the painting I'm going to do. I'm going to do it on a monitor since that's really my only option, since I didn't print it out. But it's a pretty standard thing to do for a lot of artists, is to use a monitor. Now, I don't suggest using a monitor all the time. Or using a screen. I do suggest doing things in real life because it does give you the advantage of knowing how it's going to look, how it would look in real life. Okay. So today I'm going to be painting this view of Morro Rock in the ocean. I wanted to give you guys a little bit of a variety. And this one has some nice overlapping layers. So that way you can kind of see, you know, how the application of paint actually goes. Because how you layer and how you overlap is very important. And so, let me try to get it set up to where I can still see the comments if need be. If anybody has some comments. Okay. Now that you guys see the painting, I'm going to, unfortunately, I think that the best thing to do is to focus more on the painting so you guys can see everything. And let me know if you need me to move the camera. I don't typically do video demos, so I apologize for the poor production quality. Okay, so we're going to start off with the underpainting. Now, a lot of people, I'm using a canvas paper, which is not great for creating basically a thin layer of a tone. A lot of times if you're starting out, it's nice to have sort of a middle tone made up of sort of a thinly applied paint, like a dark brown or a black that is wiped over, so that way you have a not as bright white surface, because it can be very hard to tell how a color is going to look in the end when it's contrasted against a very bright white background. So this isn't the most ideal way to start a painting. This is the way I do it because I tend to work fast when I paint, and I've just gotten used to it over time, and I understand that this white is going to mess up my perception of how that color is going to look later on. It's not going to look the same. And that's one important thing to remember about color, is that color, it's not just its own isolated thing. A color is always going to look different when surrounded next to a different color. So when you're painting, you always have to remember that what looks correct from the get-go may not look correct later on, because it's going to change. Your brain is going to interpret it differently as other colors get introduced around it. So I know that's a very kind of vague conceptual way to look at it, but it's true. A color is not a static thing. The light changes, the lighting color changes. I mean, there's so many things that will change your perception of what that color looks like. So I'm going to start out. I don't know if you guys want to see the photo alongside of it. I think it would probably be more valuable to see the painting up close. I'm going to go ahead and clip this. So what I did for starters, I took some burnt umber and I mixed a little bit of the ultramarine blue, because I like kind of a darker, kind of almost black color. So you can get notice I don't have black in my palette. That's because it's very easy to get by mixing colors in my palette. So you can get black from complementary colors, so green and red, blue and orange. In this case, I do like to start with more of an earthier kind of black, which is more the burnt umber and blue, because I don't like to be as close to dark black. So I'm going to start out by defining my horizon line. So you typically don't want the horizon line directly in the middle. That's usually you can do it if you want, but that's not always recommended. But that's a whole nother topic on composition. Just like you don't necessarily want something so prominent to be dead center. Like for instance, this rock. But in this case, it is the primary item. So I'm going to go a little above center, and I'm going to just define my horizon line. And this is all going to start out pretty loose. So it's a little above center. So that's basically where I'm going to start it. And really this period of time, it's about painting lightly, so that way you can go over it. This color is not going to interfere later on, because I'm putting it on so lightly that you will not have much interference with other paint applied over the top of it. So I'm just sort of blocking in Moral Rock right now. And you can kind of, if you want to get kind of an idea of the lightness and darkness, you can kind of just block it in. Or you don't have to, or you could just outline everything and then just let the painting do the valuing for you. It just depends on what you feel comfortable with. So right now I'm putting in the distant hills that are, there's a lot of atmosphere going on back there. As you can see, there's sort of a haze that happens at certain times of the day. So here's where the rock kind of meets the water, and then I'm going to go ahead and look at the brush line. And again, if anybody has any questions, just let me know. I'm just going to kind of talk as I paint. Whatever I can think of at the top of my head, I'm probably just going to say. Just so it's a little less boring for you guys. So I went a little bit darker. I know there's going to be some shadow here because there's this bush. So I'm just going to go a little darker. And then I know it looks like there's a little bit of a trail here, so I'm just going to make sure I remember to throw in the trail. I guess it's a little at a skew. And then there's going to be some flowers in this region, it looks like. And so there's not a lot of foliage here. I mean, this is a relatively simple one. I just want to give you guys an idea of how I start a painting. Now you can kind of do some value work. I'm just kind of scumbling, that's another word, the paint on. Just kind of rubbing it on so I have an idea of how it might look. So I think this is enough to kind of say, all right, I've drawn enough. I feel good enough with where I've arranged things. And you know, there is some flexibility, but you really want to decide as early as possible, because the more paint you apply, the harder it's going to be to make changes later. And again, this canvas paper stuff, it's very grippy. It's not like a gessoed panel. It's not like an oil primed panel, which would be very smooth and you can just kind of wipe paint off easily. Once you apply the paint on this, it sticks. So this is a different kind of paint surface that you just have to get used to. So usually what happens is you want to stack in order of what overlaps what, but in this case I think I'm going to start with, I'll probably just start with the sky. Actually, no, let's just start with a rock. I think that would be good, because then I can cut into it. So there's a lot of atmosphere going on. So I'm just going to begin mixing the color that probably best correspond to what's going on. So that's a bit too green. I think I'm gonna go and some yellow. So I'm trying to kind of devalue with the blue with some other colors, get down to more of a gray, and then I'm going to add some white to it. So as you can see, I'm now approaching more of a gray color. Now it's a little reddish, a little brown, and a little yellow, which, if you think about it, there's a little bit of a mist that the sun is catching. So it's going to be a little bit yellow, and there's atmospheric perspective, so there's blue in it. And then it's kind of dulled down with the white, so it's less chromatic. So I'm going to go ahead and try this color. I think it's pretty decent. And I'm going to go ahead and just add a little bit of a solvent because the paint's a little dry without it. And so when you're first laying out your painting, you want to just go with the general color. Now it looks extra dark right now, But the benefit is that you can always lighten it. And you typically want to always go from dark to light in an oil painting, which is kind of the opposite of what you do, say, in a watercolor. So different mediums, you usually want to start from different values. So value being like the lightness and darkness. And in this case, you want to start darker and hit the darker notes, so that way you know what your darkest darks are. Because the whole painting is basically defined based on what are your darkest darks and what are your lightest lights. Everything else is in reference to that. So while this looks dark, eventually I'll be able to go in and modify it. And who knows, maybe it'll not look so dark once I put in the surrounding hills and the sky up to it. So I'm just going to start with that for now, and then I think next I'll go ahead and work on the distant sky and the hills. So I'm going to work on the hills next. And so I would say that the hills have a little more of a reddish hue to them. And they're obviously lighter. So I'm combining the ultramarine blue with some of the red, as well as some of the titanium white. And so what you want to do is make a comparison and say, well, how much lighter or darker is this to a nearby object? And so I think I've got it relatively close enough. I'm going to thin it down a little bit now because it's very thick and I want it to be flowier. I'm going to go ahead and sort of apply my underpainting layer. And again, I can always lighten this up later. I know it looks dark right now, but that's the interesting thing, is that a lot of times it starts out looking really dark, and then later it seems to lighten up. And that is in large part due to starting out on a surface that is this pure white, and that is the biggest downside to it, is you don't really know, unless you've painted lots of times, whether or not you're painting something too dark, because it's always going to look too dark against the white. That's why it's always nice to prime your background with something that has a neutral, sort of a middle value, some kind of gray. So I think I can go a little lighter now. I think I have an understanding of where it's at. I think it needs to be a little lighter. And I'll probably just keep painting until 12, since that's lunchtime, and we'll just see how far we get. There was a lot to talk about with materials. More than I realized. I didn't rehearse what I was going to say. I was just going to kind of naturally talk about what I know. And I feel like I just barely scratched the surface. There's just so much to talk about. with oil paint. And yeah, it's really a lifelong journey becoming a painter. If you want to get into traditional artwork, if you want to learn how to paint, I'm going to switch brushes now. And I'm going to start working on the sky. And I think once I get the sky in, I'll have a much better idea of how dark I need to go with Morro Rock. So I'm just using the ultramarine blue. And what I'm seeing in the photo is that there's a gradient occurring from kind of a more chromatic blue of the sky, and then it transitioned its way down to more of like a hazy yellow-white. So I'm going to just start from the top down. Usually I go top down. So I'm starting from the top of my panel, and I'm just going to start laying it down. And there's some flexibility, you know, if you feel like you're going too dark or something, you can always lay in some more lighter paint on top of it. I mean, it's always, general rule is always better to start dark, because it's always easier than the reverse. And if you work with your paint too much and you try to alter it too much, you can always end up making things muddy. Or there's times where you just can't get dark enough, because with oil paint, once you've gone too light, it's hard to really go darker unless you wipe out the paint. I think I can go maybe a little more blue up top. And there's nothing wrong with leaving things kind of brushy. You know, some people just have the tendency to just tighten everything up or blend everything up so it no longer even looks like a painting anymore. But I really think having some, you know, thickness to your paint and being able to see it as a painting and not just a photo makes that painting a lot more powerful. So I'm starting with sort of a darker, more saturated blue up top, and then I'm going to transition to lighter blue as I work my way down. But I kind of have to just kind of start from the top and just sort of work my way down. And this canvas paper, you know, it's pretty crippy, and I have to work it a little bit more into the paper. With the gesso, you don't really have to kind of force it on as much as I am with this stuff. So it would look different the way I'm applying it if I was using a gessoed panel. Now, unfortunately, this painting doesn't have any clouds in it. But, you know, it's California, and sometimes you don't get a lot of clouds, so I didn't have a lot of good reference photos. that kind of had both the ocean and the overlap and clouds and everything I wanted to show. I was a little torn as to what kind of painting to choose, but I figured just going with something a little more iconic, like more rock, was a pretty safe bet for you guys. So the sky's coming in, and now you can get a better idea of the relationship between the rock and the hills in the background. And this will let me know if I need to go that much darker. So I'm gonna add a little bit of yellow because it's a little hazier, although it's so easy to accidentally add too much yellow because it's a very strong color. So I'm gonna kind of lighten it up a little more too, and then I'm gonna try to work it in and see how that works. I think this is fine. And so at this point I can start to kind of cut into the hillside. And this is where, understanding the overlapping. So the sky, think of the sky as being behind the hills. And so I tend to like a little more of a clean line on the hills. So if you're studying art, you'd learn about, hard edges and soft edges, and there's a lot to learn about that. So a hard edge is basically a clean, straight edge where two surfaces or colors or shapes meet. A soft edge is basically how it sounds. It's going to be kind of more blended. There's going to be a less distinction of a border with a soft edge. So it's really up to the artist how they want to do it, because some of it is using your artistic license, and some, a hard edge will attract the eye. And so sometimes you don't want a hard edge. Maybe you want a soft edge because you want to draw the human eye away, and you want to keep the viewer focused on a particular region, or you're trying to create a particular flow in the painting. And if you have a hard edge, it may distract the viewer and kind of take the viewer off the path that you didn't want them to take. So while this is just kind of a quick demo, there's so many things to think about, and that's where painting enough to where you can spend more time thinking about composition and what you're trying to achieve. That's the end goal. Making it so the actual painting is natural, and you don't have to think about it as much. Getting comfortable with your materials. So it's less of a struggle and you're not thinking about it all the time. I think that part of being an artist is finding shortcuts or repeating patterns where you're not doing something that you're completely unfamiliar with every time. So I refer to, like, when I create a clean line, I say that I'm cutting into the paint. So I'm creating this cut, and that's how you kind of can get a nice clean line, is by overlapping one paint layer to another, and you can create this clean transition by cutting an edge of one paint color into another, and that creates a cleaner edge. So I think I'm about done enough with the sky there. Now I can tell that I need to go lighter in the hills, which is okay. It looks like I need to add a little more yellow. But I'm going to go ahead and just move on to the ocean now, because eventually we'll be running out of time. So I'm going to go ahead and create my watercolor. And it looks like there's definitely some green or some yellows in it. So I'm going to play around with that. I'm going to mix the ultramarine with the viridian, and then I'm going to add some white and see what happens there. So looks like I need to go a little more blue. So I think I'm getting closer to what I need. So it starts, basically the water's darker and the deeper water, and then as it gets closer inland it gets lighter. So I'm going to try out this. And again, I'm going to be cutting into another shape. So the water is basically overlapping almost, in a way. I mean, it's the horizon, but think of it as the water's going to be coming up to those hills, and you want to create a nice clean line, because it's the water line. It's going to act as your horizon line. And whenever the paint feels a little draggy, when I'm doing my underpainting, I'll just add a little bit more of my solvent, so that way it can flow and I can get a nice thin starting point. So, building that horizon line. Now, the water strokes, so the brush strokes, as you get closer to the, I guess at least for the water. So I would say with the sky, I did a lot of vertical strokes, because the gradient kind of goes from a darker blue to a lighter blue in a vertical direction. Now the water, it's waves, and it's planar, you know, it's almost like a plane surface, and so it makes more sense to define the water by doing brush strokes that are more horizontal. So I would do horizontal brush strokes instead. Yellow. Now the white that you see in the waves is something that can be applied later. So remember, when you're just starting the painting, worry about the overall shapes and try to avoid getting into the details, because the first thing you want to do is try to create an overall cohesive look, where if you're squinting at it, it looks like you're seeing. It looks like what you're trying to paint. And so kind of squinting at it early on is a really handy way to know for sure if it passes the squint test, then you can work into the details. So, and I'm still painting pretty thin. I wouldn't paint a lot thicker until I get more into the second layer of this Alla Prima. So I'm going to go ahead and maybe throw in the beach. And it's kind of a bluish orange. That's what I'm seeing. Because again, it's hazy. There's some atmosphere going on. And then I'm going to go ahead and start blocking in the foreground. So I'm going to grab another brush, because I don't want to mix some of these these brushes that I used a lot of blue with. It's not going to be as much blue in the foreground because a lot of blue is either the water, the sky, or the atmosphere. And so I'm going to kind of build up some of my darks. And as you can see, it's almost a black. But I'm going to put in my darkest darks right now. And then I'll overlay it with the lighter foliage of the brush. Okay. So next I might as well get some of the green from the brush. Now it's not just green, it's not just Viridian, so I'm going to mix in some yellow. Maybe a little bit of orange. I'll try that out. And because I put the shadow in first, That means I can kind of go into the shadow now. And that'll give the brush a sense of depth. And again, everything you see looks dark, but later I would come in once I've blocked it in. So blocking in means like I've at least coated the surface with one layer. And due to time constraints, because this usually takes a couple hours, but things lighten up as I progress. So I'm just going to get some of the greenery in. And with the foreground, it's kind of, there's a lot of oranges and stuff, but I'm going to get some of the green in while I can. Now the trail is kind of a grayish color, so I'm going to go ahead and use some of the existing gray that I have. Just sort of mark it out so I know it's there. And so I can work some of the foliage of the foreground into it later. And then probably start working in some of the kind of neutral oranges and yellows of the dried grass into the foreground next. some kind of more reddish colors I see also, so you can add some kind of more reddish brown highlights to it here and there. So almost done with the block in. And after the block-in is where you really start to refine it, and it really starts to look like how you want it. And that's the hard thing with oil painting, is that when you're first starting out, you know, it's very unsatisfying starting out any oil painting, because a lot of times it just doesn't look great starting out. But then as you keep going with it, hopefully, you'll get it to where you want it to. So the reward always comes almost to the last few brush strokes. It's really interesting. You know, it goes from looking bad, and then it starts looking better, and then once you get kind of near the end, that's when it really starts to look good. And I find that happens a lot, is that you have to stick with it. So if you're feeling like your painting's not doing great, well, just stick with it. You may not be done yet. Now I'm seeing some darker stuff here that I want to throw in. Some shadows that I lost. So it's almost 12, so probably just leave it at this. I think I'm getting about done. With the initial. So if I were to keep going, I would say that we'd be getting out of the block-in phase. So maybe I'll work just a little bit longer, but hopefully for those who stuck around, they were able to get some useful information on the materials I use, an introduction to all the different types of solvents and mediums you have available to you, and just generally what you need to get started doing outdoor or plein air paintings. And there's a lot still to be done on this painting. But for now, I'm just gonna do a couple little things and then I'll be done, I think. I'm gonna switch brushes to something a little smaller so I can get some of the details of the rock. And usually what you want to do is you just kind of start with something that's close in value and kind of sketch it out before you add anything that's a lot stronger in value, because it'll be hard to reverse that. And at this point you can start using thicker paint if you feel confident that you like what you see. And you want to start adding some texture and some variety. Because right now the painting's pretty flat. But that's a good thing, because you didn't want to start by adding too much thick paint right at the get-go if you're concerned about making sure that it's drawn properly. Oh, thanks, Spencer. So at this point you can start adding a little more variety. Because right now the painting's pretty boring. And you need to add some variation to all the basic shapes that you started with. So I'm adding a little more yellow to this because it's hazier. There's just a little more gradient happening in these distant hills. So you can see that once you get that underpainting in, you can really start to blend, right? So the paint just isn't going directly on top. You're able to really kind of blend it in. And you can work it as much as you want. You don't want to go too far with it a lot of times because it'll start looking muddy. But if you're careful, you can really kind of add layer, you can add gradient, you can add variety to it. And so this is why it's so important to have a good underpainting. It is really the foundation from which everything else you do. It's going to be easier or harder for you based on how you set things up from the get-go. So now I'm able to really start to lighten things up on the rock, because now I have enough reference to tell me how much lighter or darker I should go. So at this point, I'll probably go back to the water, start focusing on the water a little bit more, since it's pretty boring as it is. green to the water, since I'm seeing there is some kind of green color going on. I'm going to start getting a little thicker with the paint. And always while you're painting, think about drawing. You're always drawing. So I'm going to go ahead and start painting in the waves. And they look white, but they most likely have some yellow in them. So let's test out some of this. Okay. Well, I'd say at this point, you guys have seen enough to see the overall process. At this point, I'm just adding some details. And, you know, with the foreground, you've got a lot more kind of vertical strokes going on. Because you're getting that variation from all the foliage rising up from the ground. And then you're going to get some kind of gray from the branches. The dead branches. Some little flowers in the corner in this painting. Might as well add them. Yeah, I use a lot of solid paint, really. I've just gotten used to it. I mean, if anything, I just add a little bit of a solvent if it's too thick. Yeah, it's nice to use as much just of pure paint as possible. Because like you said, you can stack, and then also it does keep the color richer, definitely. Because anytime you use medium, you're basically dissolving your paint and you're reducing the chroma. And so you end up with a basically a duller painting. I mean, not necessarily, but that's something you have to really look out for if you add a lot of medium. And you want to keep, especially with oil painting, because things can get dull just because you're mixing the paint. It's not a bad idea to just get used to not using as much medium, because you want to keep the color intact as much as you can. Well, I think I'm pretty much done with the demo here. If anybody has any further questions, let me know. I'll be happy to answer them. So let's do a quick close-up of the painting. And so there's the painting. Just a quick, simple demo. There's the reference photo I took. I wish there was enough space on the camera to be able to show all the paints I used, the reference photo, plus the painting. But here's the photo. There's the painting. Hopefully you guys learned a lot. And that's it. Thank you very much.